In this episode, we take a topic that often gets misunderstood by beginners and even by experienced teams, which is the role of security frameworks in building a mature security program. A framework is not supposed to be a pile of boxes you check to satisfy someone else, and it is not supposed to be a rigid script that ignores how your organization actually works. A framework is a structured way to organize good security thinking, so you can build capabilities in a sensible order, measure progress, and communicate clearly about what is in place and what is missing. The reason frameworks matter is that security is too large to hold in your head all at once, and without structure, programs often become reactive, uneven, and driven by the loudest problem of the week. Frameworks provide a map that keeps you moving in a direction, even when emergencies and new threats appear. The danger is checkbox compliance, where teams focus on looking compliant rather than becoming safer, and that danger is real because it is easier to show documents than to change outcomes. For brand new learners, the goal is to understand how frameworks can be used as tools for maturity, not as rituals for approval. A helpful first step is to define what a framework is in practical terms. A security framework is a collection of organized security domains, practices, and outcomes that describe what a well-managed program should do. Some frameworks are built for broad program guidance, some are built for risk management, and some are built for specific compliance contexts. But the common thread is that they provide a shared language. That shared language helps teams compare current state to desired state and plan improvements in a way that is not random. For beginners, it helps to think of a framework like a curriculum for learning, where topics are grouped, sequenced, and connected so you do not learn in a chaotic order. In a security program, the framework helps you avoid building advanced capabilities on top of missing foundations, such as trying to run sophisticated monitoring when you do not have consistent logging or asset visibility. It also helps you spot gaps, such as having strong technical controls but weak governance or weak incident readiness. A framework does not do the work for you, but it helps you choose the work and justify it. When you treat the framework as a map, you stay oriented, and when you treat it as a checklist, you can end up lost while believing you are done. To understand how frameworks mature programs, it helps to separate the idea of controls from the idea of outcomes. A control is an action or mechanism, like enforcing authentication requirements or centralizing logs, while an outcome is what changes in the environment, like reduced unauthorized access or improved incident response time. Checkbox compliance tends to measure controls as artifacts, like policies and procedures, without verifying outcomes, which creates a gap between paperwork and reality. A maturity-focused approach uses the framework to define intended outcomes and then uses controls as means to those ends. For example, a framework might imply that you should manage identities effectively, but the maturity question is whether your identity practices actually reduce account misuse and enable timely access reviews. If you only check that an access policy exists, you might miss that the policy is ignored or that access reviews are not actually happening. For beginners, this distinction is crucial because it explains why organizations can pass audits and still suffer incidents. Maturity requires the control to be alive, enforced, measured, and improved, not merely written down. When you view frameworks through outcomes, you shift from compliance theater to risk reduction. Another reason frameworks help is that they create consistency across time and across teams, which is essential when organizations grow or change. Without a framework, security priorities may depend on which leader is in charge or which team complains the loudest, leading to whiplash and uneven coverage. With a framework, you can maintain continuity because the framework provides a stable reference for what good looks like. This stability does not mean stagnation, because frameworks can be adapted and updated, but it does mean you are less likely to forget core responsibilities like incident preparation or asset management when the organization is busy. For beginners, it helps to see frameworks as a way to protect the program from short-term distractions. They also help during staff turnover, because new personnel can learn the program's structure and priorities more quickly. When a program is organized around a framework, the work is easier to hand off, because responsibilities align to known domains. This is one of the quiet ways frameworks improve resilience, because programs that depend on tribal knowledge often collapse when key people leave. Frameworks also help you make trade-offs, which is a core security leadership skill. Every program has limited capacity, and frameworks give you a way to choose what to do first and what to do later. For example, if you identify gaps in multiple domains, you can use the framework to assess which gaps are foundational and which depend on others. You might decide that asset inventory and identity governance must come before advanced detection use cases, because detection depends on knowing what you have and who is doing what. Framework thinking encourages sequencing, which reduces wasted effort and improves success rate. It also helps you communicate trade-offs to stakeholders, because you can explain that certain improvements are prerequisites for other improvements. For beginners, this is important because it shows that security is not a random collection of projects. It is a system, and systems improve when you build the right foundations first. Frameworks are useful precisely because they encourage systems thinking. The main risk of frameworks is that they can be used as a substitute for thinking, which is how checkbox compliance takes over. Checkbox compliance often shows up when teams focus on completing evidence for an audit rather than improving real controls. It can also show up when teams implement a control only to satisfy a requirement, without understanding how it should operate in their environment. For beginners, a practical sign of checkbox compliance is when the organization cannot explain how a control reduces risk, only that it exists. Another sign is when documentation is perfect but monitoring and measurement are weak, meaning the organization cannot prove the control is effective. Checkbox compliance also tends to create brittle security, because controls may exist on paper but are not maintained, tuned, or updated as the environment changes. The result is drift, where the program looks mature in reports but becomes progressively less aligned with reality. Avoiding this requires treating the framework as guidance that must be interpreted in context, not as a literal set of tasks. It also requires leadership that values operational reality over appearances. When that leadership is missing, frameworks become ceremonial, and ceremonies do not stop attackers. A maturity-driven approach to frameworks begins with translation, meaning you translate framework language into the specific reality of your organization. Frameworks often use broad terms like manage assets, protect data, respond to incidents, and each of those broad terms can mean different things depending on whether you are a hospital, a software company, a retailer, or a school. Translation means asking what assets matter here, what data matters here, and what incidents look like here. It also means identifying which teams own which parts of the work and how responsibilities will be coordinated. For beginners, this translation step is where frameworks become useful rather than intimidating, because it turns generic guidance into specific decisions. Translation also helps prevent overbuilding, because frameworks can include many practices, and not every practice is equally urgent for every environment. A small organization may need a simpler implementation than a large enterprise, but the maturity approach remains the same. Prioritize core outcomes, then expand as capacity grows. When you translate frameworks into your context, you keep the program focused and avoid wasting effort on low-value formalities. Measurement is another key element that prevents checkbox compliance, because measurement turns framework adoption into evidence of maturity. Measurement does not mean you reduce security to a single score, because a single score can hide important details. Instead, measurement means you define indicators that show whether key outcomes are improving, such as whether vulnerability remediation is faster, whether access control exceptions are decreasing, or whether incident response time is improving. Frameworks can guide what you should measure by pointing to the capabilities that matter most. For beginners, it helps to understand that measurement is the difference between believing you are mature and knowing you are maturing. Measurement also supports governance, because leaders can see where progress is real and where gaps remain. It also supports continuous improvement, because metrics reveal where processes are failing or where controls are producing too much noise. When frameworks are paired with metrics, the program becomes harder to fake, because outcomes must be demonstrated. This is one of the most practical defenses against compliance theater. Another maturity practice is treating framework adoption as a continuous journey rather than a one-time project. If you treat a framework like a finish line, you will rush to complete tasks and then stop paying attention, which creates drift. If you treat it like a cycle, you will assess, prioritize, implement, measure, and reassess, which keeps the program aligned with change. For beginners, It is valuable to understand that environments evolve constantly, with new systems, new user behaviors, and new threats, so a program that is not revisited will become outdated. A framework provides a stable structure for revisiting the program, because you can periodically review each domain and ask whether controls are still effective. This also supports ownership clarity, because each domain can have an owner who reports on status, gaps, and plans. Continuous framework use also supports training and onboarding, because new team members can learn the program through the framework lens. Over time, the framework becomes part of how the organization thinks about security, which is a mark of maturity. The framework stops being a document and starts being a shared mental model. Framework adoption also requires balance between standardization and flexibility, because too much standardization can make the program rigid and too much flexibility can make it inconsistent. Standardization helps by creating consistent baselines, repeatable processes, and clear expectations. Flexibility helps by allowing teams to adapt controls to different systems and constraints while still meeting the intent. The trick is to standardize the outcomes and the minimum requirements, while allowing some flexibility in implementation details when justified. For beginners, it helps to see this as the difference between requiring seatbelts and dictating the exact brand of seatbelt. You want the safety outcome, but you may allow variation in how it is achieved, as long as it is effective. Governance mechanisms, such as clear decision rights and exception handling, help manage this balance. When exceptions are documented and reviewed, flexibility does not become chaos. When standards are clear and measured, standardization does not become rigidity for its own sake. A maturity-focused framework approach uses both, because real environments are diverse and cannot be forced into a single mold without breaking. A particularly important maturity move is integrating the framework into program management, so that roadmap work and backlog work align to framework domains and outcomes. This prevents the framework from being something you reference only during audits. If your roadmap initiatives are tied to framework capabilities, you can show how projects improve maturity in concrete ways. For example, improving centralized logging supports monitoring and incident investigation outcomes, while improving identity governance supports access control outcomes. This integration also helps prioritize across competing projects, because you can see which framework areas are underdeveloped and which are already strong. For beginners, the key is that frameworks should influence day-to-day decisions, not just annual reporting. They should help you decide what to build next, what to measure, and what to revisit. When the framework is embedded in planning and reporting, it becomes a living guide rather than a dusty checklist. That living integration is one of the strongest protections against checkbox behavior. As you bring this together, adopting security frameworks to mature programs without checkbox compliance is ultimately about intent and discipline. Frameworks provide structure, shared language, and a path for building capabilities in a sensible order, which helps programs grow more consistent and resilient over time. Checkbox compliance happens when teams focus on appearances, artifacts, and one-time completion instead of operational reality and measurable outcomes. Avoiding that requires translating framework guidance into your organization's context, prioritizing outcomes over documents, measuring effectiveness, and revisiting the program regularly as the environment changes. It also requires integrating framework thinking into governance and program management so decisions, projects, and ownership align to maturity goals. For a brand new learner, the most important takeaway is that frameworks are powerful when they are treated as maps, not trophies. They help you steer a complex program, communicate priorities, and prove progress, but only if you keep the focus on reducing real risk rather than satisfying a checklist. When you do that, framework adoption becomes a practical engine for improvement and a steady guide that keeps security moving forward even when the organization is busy and the threat landscape shifts.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.